Hello, and welcome to an MCAT recording from our second Saturday Family Passport program. The Passport program encourages library patrons to visit all the library partners on the second Saturday of each month. The partners are the Living Lab, Spectrum Discovery Area, Families First Learning Lab, and MCAT, Missoula's community media resource. In this program, Dr. Sara Scott gives a presentation on our fall theme, Montana's DNA. Dr. Scott tells the story of Montana's first people.
Hi everybody, my name is Sara Scott and I'm an archaeologist, and I'm here today to talk about Montana's DNA and the first people that lived in Montana. Before I get started, I want to make it clear that archaeologists don't study dinosaurs. A lot of people, when I tell them that I'm an archaeologist, they'll respond, I love dinosaurs. Well, there's about 50 million years that separates dinosaurs and humans, and so it's important to make that distinction. So what I do is I look at the kinds of things that people left behind. They might camp somewhere, and then based on the kinds of things left behind, we reconstruct a picture of what they were eating, what they were cooking, all those different things. So that's what archaeologists do. Based on what's found in the ground, we reconstruct the lifeway of people before us. So how long have people been in Montana? Well, 15,000 years. And so that's quite a long time. And so Montana's first people, we have archaeological sites here in Montana that date to 15,000 years. And we know that because they've been excavated and radiocarbon dated. So Montanans have been here for 15,000 years, but how did the people that first came to Montana get here? Well, here's a little bit of a complicated graph that shows you that we evolved as humans in Africa. And about 200,000 years ago, 100,000 years ago, people started moving out of Africa into Europe, Southwestern Asia, and then finally to Siberia. And then finally, they moved across. Things were much colder then, and they moved across the Bering Strait into Alaska, and then down through Canada and into North America. This happened about 15,000 years ago, but people were living in Europe and China and Siberia for many more thousands of years. So it's important to know that. And the first people who moved out of Africa, it wasn't just us, Homo sapiens. It was Neanderthals, Denisovians, and Homo sapiens too. Different people moved out around 100,000, 200,000 years ago and went to different areas. And a lot of people think about when they look at these Neanderthal people, they think these people were primitive and that they lived in caves, almost kind of like a Fred Flintstone kind of image of these people, when in fact Neanderthal people were very sophisticated. And here on the graph, there's a picture of horses, and those horses were painted inside Chauvet Cave in France, and those are 36,000 years old. And so people were very sophisticated back then. So you don't want to think of them as cavemen with clubs. They were sophisticated and thinking with brains just like you and me. So how did these people from Africa moving into Europe, moving into Siberia, how did they get over to North America to come to Montana? Well, they came on foot. They were walking. As I mentioned, it was much colder then. This was right at the end of the Pleistocene. So it was much colder. So they walked across basically a sheet of ice to get to Alaska. And then when they got there, they did encounter many more big ice flows, and it was hard to get around. So a lot of people think, scientists think now, that they also used boats to come down the Pacific coast into North America. And we don't, in terms of thinking about like, oh, well, what kind of boats were they? I think they were made out of skin, and I think they were made out of wood. But because those would have been so old, they haven't survived, so we don't have any. But we have a lot of archaeologists with a lot of different theories of how people got here. So as I mentioned, when people first came to Montana, it was much colder. So 15,000 years ago, we were still in the Pleistocene. So it was very cold climate, and there were animals like this, the mammoth here pictured, just very large animals, extinct forms of bison, which were much larger than the current bison that we have today. Short-faced bears, all sorts of animals that are now extinct, but they were hunting those using spears. If you can imagine that, something as large as a mammoth hunting it with a spear, but people collectively worked together and were able to bring these animals down. So around 10,000 years ago, things started to get warmer. And as people started moving into North America, Montana is the first people with bringing their DNA here. It was warmer. So as it got warmer, they were able to spread out in North America. And they were using hunting with like those big animals, these projectile points like that are shown here. And the first people that came, they were hunters and gatherers. So they weren't living in sedentary villages with a big population. They were small bands of people that moved around seasonally. They would know where resources were, and they would move to those areas, say in the spring or in the fall, to pursue those resources, whether it be animals or a certain kind of plants. So they were nomadic. They weren't staying in one place. They were moving around. So how did people get around? Are they just walking and on foot with like leather packs? They actually had, and dogs have been around for about 9,000 years, at least in North America. We know that people had dogs, and they used dogs to help them transport their materials with what's called, as you can see pictured here, called a travois. And they would load their gear up on the travois that the dog would pull, so the dogs would help them get their gear from one camp to another. And this was before about 1700, and then around in the 1730s, horses were acquired here in Montana, which changed everything very radically because people could carry way more equipment, and they also could travel much further distances. So the travois was how people transported their goods. So in terms of animals, again, these nomadic hunter and gatherers, here are some of the animals that they hunted. Bison, definitely on the eastern side of the Continental Divide, was the preferred species. You get one bison and it provides a lot of meat. Elk were also hunted, deer, antelope, and also bighorn sheep. And how do we know this? We know this because archaeological sites that were excavated were finding the bones of all these animals, and we know especially how important bison were to people. And the animals that were hunted, it wasn't just for food, but my gosh, with a bison, you would use the horn as a spoon, you would use the hide for food and moccasins, and you'd use the stomach as a pouch that you could carry your goods in. So they used all different parts of the animal. So what were some of the ways that they hunted animals back then? Well, I mentioned buffalo were really important. And here you can see this one big butte here, which shows up here on the screen. People would move bison herds up to the top of that butte. They would slowly herd them over, sometimes many days, using animal skins. They would build rock cairns in a line where people would sit behind the rock cairn and they would wave plants and they would wave animal skins, and it would scare the bison into the direction that they wanted to go. And then eventually they would drive the bison off the cliff, and they would either die from falling off the cliff, or there were also hunters below the cliff that would kill them with thrusting spears. So, and then we show here on the bottom corner over here is a rock wall, and this is down in southwestern Montana, and we think that they were hunting. Bighorn sheep would come across these walls. They would walk along the rock wall, and then suddenly there'd be an opening, and there would be hunters there when there was an opening to kill the bighorn sheep. And this top picture here is an actual wooden trap, and that also was for bighorn sheep. They went inside, and as soon as they got inside, the door closed and they were captured. So those were some of the hunting strategies they had. Initially, they were using, as I mentioned, when people first came to Montana, they were using projectile points on the end of a spear, and that they would stab the animals with, and it was handheld. And then they used an atlatl, which is a wooden board that they could put an arrow in, which basically extended the elbow, so it gave the throwing distance. It really increased how far people could throw. And then by 1,500 years ago, people were using the bow and arrow, which was so much easier for people to keep their distance from game and still be able to kill them. And it also kept them safer because they didn't have to get too close to the animals. And one thing also that's important is people weren't just eating meat, but they also collected all sorts of plants that were used not only for food, which gave them vitamin C, but they were also used for medicinal purposes. Plants that we see now, there's a lot of yarrow out on our landscape still in Montana, and that was a really good plant that helped blood coagulate, so that if you cut yourself, you didn't just bleed out. You could put yarrow on it, and it helped the blood to coagulate, and it helped you to stop bleeding. Other plants, elderberries, huckleberries, camas, bitterroot was really an important plant. And the camas and the bitterroot, those were cooked in ovens, not like the ovens that we open our oven and turn it on 350, but people would do these pits and put rocks in and fires and then let it burn down, and then they would cook like the bitter root and the camas root in these fires, slowly roast them so that they were cooked. Another important food, they would grind up, like they would collect berries, and they also dried a lot of their meat so that they might kill a very large buffalo. They would skin it, cut the meat up, and then put it on a wooden drying rack, and then they would mix the dried meat with, say, elderberries or huckleberries, and then pound it down and crush it, and then make it into little cakes that they could use in the winter for food, when food was way less available than during the summer. So those are some important things, but some of here I have a digging stick. This is the type of stick that people would use to dig up bitter roots or camas. And the end of it is fire hardened, so it's hard. So people were much more able to get down deep into the ground and then pull up the bitter root. And the handle on this is an antler handle. This is not an original digging stick, but this is a replica made by a fella, Salish Kootenai person, Tim Ryan. So in terms of plant food processing, and a lot of these things are not frequently found in the archaeological record, and they're usually tasks that women did. But you will find things like this, which people on the end of this, it's worn down. So you know that this has been used against a hard surface to grind things down, to grind meat down or to grind down berries. And then this was also used against a rock, and you can see the surface of this is very worn down, so that you know by the way the rock is shaped that somebody was pushing this along another rock so that they could grind their food up. So we all know how cold it gets in Montana over the winter, and imagine camping out, and maybe some of you have, which if you have, kudos to you. But imagine trying to stay warm outside when it's 10 below. So how did people, Montana's first people, how did they stay warm? Well, as you can see here, people lived in teepees, and these were transportable. They moved them around with horses and also dogs, carrying teepee poles, carrying the skins. And you can see this little girl sitting here. And what people would do is they would pitch a teepee, and then to hold the skin down that's around the poles, they would put rocks around it. And you can see this picture here that shows this ring. That's a teepee ring. So that's an ancient ring where there once was a teepee. And there's some archaeological sites in Montana where you will find 200 teepee rings, so you know that people were camped in big groups in that area. And people also use just natural caves that we find in our landscape. The cave shown here, that's Pictograph Cave, which is about 8 miles from Billings, Montana. So if you're ever in Billings, ask your parents to take you to Pictograph Cave, because it's a state park and it's a wonderful state park. Well, at Pictograph Cave, and it was a dry cave, so people were camped in this cave for about over 5,000 years. So that's many, many generations of people that were camped inside the cave. And because the cave is protected and it doesn't get rain or snow, a lot of the artifacts that were left behind, pieces of basketry, pieces of rope, very perishable materials, they actually were preserved. Projectile points that were hafted onto a wooden spear, a whole assemblage of the daily life of the kind of artifacts that people used were preserved at Pictograph Cave, which make it a very important archaeological site. And they also use things called wiki-ups, which is down here, which is just, it's more of an informal type of structure. The wiki-up usually had brush around it, and then a lot of times, sometimes bark or sticks would line it, and also so they could stay inside it, just a very temporary shelter that they might use for overnight to keep them warm. But all these things, especially like the teepee and the cave, really protected people from the elements and kept them warm. So they were able to survive using these types of features on the landscape. So what else did people do? What else was important to them? Well, one of the important aspects of hunting is to make projectile points, or what people call arrowheads, to kill game, to put it on the end of a bow, and to put it on the end of an arrow, or to put it on the end of a thrusting spear. And so what people did is they went to certain spots where they quarried stone, and they knew it's not like you can just use any rock. You had to use a special kind of rock that flakes really easily. And in fact, this is a piece of obsidian, and this comes from obsidian cliffs in Yellowstone Park. And this piece of obsidian, people would go to a big obsidian flow, and there's many of these out in Oregon where there's been a lot of volcanic activity. So they would go and get a big piece of obsidian, they would chip it down with a hammerstone, they would work it down, and then anytime they needed to make a tool, they would just chip off a big chunk of this, and then they would work more finely around it to make the tool. So this, I think, is the original Swiss Army knife, because so many different tools can be made from this one thing. And this would be called a biface core in the archaeology jargon. So one of the other things that people did in Montana was to, people, again, we tend to think of hunters and gatherers, maybe in a more rudimentary way, but people were very sophisticated. And they had a lot of rituals, they had a lot of ceremonies, and many times as part of this, they would paint images on a cliff face to commemorate a ritual, or a handprint might show that this person participated in a ceremony. And so this was really important to Montana's early people. And you still find some of these sites around Montana. And as you can see, like from this image, it has modern people have carved their names and initials into it. And that's vandalism, and that's something that we don't want to do at archaeological sites. I mean, these are sacred sites to Montana's indigenous people, and to do that kind of thing, one, it's against the law, but also it's very disrespectful. So please don't ever do something like that. And this here, this is a paintbrush, and these are extremely rare in the archaeological record, and this was found at Pictograph Cave. And you can see where people were dipping this, the wood part is made from sagebrush, and they would dip the end into a pigment that they had made up, mixed with a bunch of different binders, and then they would apply their image to the rock face. And what they would do, they would select out certain areas, like there's an area between here and Drummond where you see all this red pigment eroding out of a road cut, and people would know where these pigment sources were. They would get the pigment, which was a powder, and then they would mix it with all sorts of binders. They would use blood, like their own blood or blood from an animal. They would use animal fat. They would use berry juice, also egg yolk, it's like from a bird egg. They would use all sorts of things, charcoal as well, as a paint binder so that they could make these images. And some of these images, which I have studied over in the Helena area, we were able to get scientifically date those using radiocarbon information, and they dated to 1,200 years ago. So even though it looks like you would think, oh, if I painted something out on a rock face, that it might just disintegrate because it's out in the elements, well, what happens is the sun bakes the pigment into the rock face, and then also sometimes different minerals come washing down, cover the image, and so the image becomes part of the rock surface. And so these are pretty much baked into the rock surface, and it does help them with preservation. So once, as I mentioned, the horse was very important to indigenous people in Montana because they could travel much further. They could also carry way more. It was very important. But also with the coming of the horse came fur trappers, European fur trappers that were coming into Montana looking for things like beaver pelts that could be made into hats. And so suddenly you have people that had lived here for thousands of years, but there's trappers coming in who are exploiting resources that Indian people used. And then we all know about Lewis and Clark, who came here in 1805 and 1806. And with them, they wrote about what they observed in Montana and then reported it back to people that lived in Philadelphia and St. Louis. And it kind of started the beginning for Indian people, kind of a little bit the end of them being able to live freely out on the Montana landscape. Because after Lewis and Clark, suddenly in the 1860s came miners, and a town like, if any of you have ever been to Lincoln, over the course of just a few years, Lincoln went from nothing to 3,000 people living there because they were mining resources that were in the Lincoln area. And then with the miners came homesteaders and wagon trains, and people started to take over what once was Indian territory, now was being taken over by Europeans. The U.S. Army established a lot of different, the United States government established treaties with Indian people that lived here, including the Salish, the Blackfeet, the Nez Perce, very many tribes. But a lot of those treaties were not honored, and the land area that they first started with became cut down in then subsequent treaties so that they ended up with much less space. So with all these people moving in, Indian tribes were moved onto reservations, where now we have 7 reservations in Montana, with the Little Shell being added, but they don't have any land yet, so that would be the 8th if they do. And so the people that were the first Montanans, our indigenous Indian people, they still are here today. A lot of times we act as if they're not here, but they're very much here, living on reservations, living in our communities, and they're very active in terms of trying to preserve their own language. They hold a lot of ceremonies and powwows and try and preserve their traditional culture. In fact, I did used to work for Montana State Parks, and one of our state parks, First Peoples, it's a buffalo jump, like I showed you. A lot of different Indian groups from Montana come to First Peoples buffalo jump with elders come with much younger people, and they teach them about the traditional ways and how people lived on the landscape 300, 2,000, 5,000 years ago. So that's the story of Montana's first people, and Montana's Indian tribes are still very much alive here in Montana today. Thank you.